Yes, I started out as the winemaker at Chimney Rock before the Terlatos bought it for Hack Wilson. And when the Terlatos bought the property, they kind of got me along with the deal, I suppose. And then a couple of years after that, the guy that was running Rutherford Hill at the time needed some help up here with winemaking, and so he asked me if I would help him. And I said, well, sure, but I need to have some authority to do that. The winemakers up here aren't going to take kindly to me just telling them what to do. So they made me the VP of Winemaking for all the Terlato properties, and so that's how I got started. The Terlatos were looking for property in Washington for a long time, actually, and I went up and looked at several properties for them over the years, and one in Walla Walla and another one. And at some point, they called me up and said, you know, they're looking at this property in Red Mountain. Would I go look at it? And so I went with the chief financial officer at the time, and he and I went up and looked at it. It's like, God, this is great. Klipsun is the original, well, maybe not the first, but it's really the best known property in Red Mountain. And it was started by the Gellises, and Patricia Gellis kind of ran the operation, and her husband was a metallurgist at Hanford. And they bought the property in the early 80s when it was just sagebrush, and thought, you know, they didn't know anything about wine, but they thought, well, let's put a vineyard in. And of course, it ended up being in a good spot. And so she was very clever at developing the brand. And Klipsun is the word itself is an interesting story.
I was going to get to that, yeah.
Okay, well, it's Pidgin English. It's not, you know, if you go back far enough, the Native Americans in the Northwest were fur traders with one of the early trading companies that traded in furs and stuff. And of course, the British weren't going to learn any of the Native American languages, so the Indians had to learn English. And so most of them, you know, got by with whatever, you know, they could make themselves understood. And so most of it was, there's a whole pidgin language in the Northwest from several of these American Indian tribes, and Klipsun means clipped sun. So it's the setting sun. So if you think about it, you know, as the sun goes down over the horizon, it's only half of it, and that's clipped in their mind, and so it was the clipped sun. And
Makes good sense.
It's a perfectly lovely word, and it fits the concept of Northwest and Washington being independent or separate from other wine regions, and you know, why not use a word like that? So that's how they came by it. And then Patricia was very careful with her brand, and so they didn't have their own winery, and never did. But she only sold fruit to people that she thought made the best wines in Washington. And so, and she would, on several occasions, made a point to say that wineries that had gotten 100 points, and you name the reviewer, that was because of her wine, her grapes.
Yeah, sure.
And I just remember once her telling the story about calling up one winemaker and said, you know, what'd you do to my grapes? I don't like this, and she quit selling it to him.
Wow.
So she ran things with an iron fist, and in fact, many of the winemakers I talked to that we still sell fruit to up there, you know, they have lots of stories about her. So when the Terlatos sent me up there to look at it, I thought, well, God, this is really a great spot. And so it took us almost a year to go through all the due diligence and stuff to buy the property. And that was because of water rights in Washington. If you don't have a water right, you don't have anything. I mean, I remember John Terlato asking me about, could we dry farm up there? And I said, well, yeah, if you want to grow sagebrush, you know, you get 3 inches of rain a year. That's it. And grapevines take about 18 to grow. To delve into that a little bit, most people think of desert as hot, but it's not necessarily hot. It's just doesn't have any water. And the Yakima Valley is in the rain shadow of the Cascades, and so as the weather comes from the west, as the clouds go over the Cascades, they cool, and all the water rains out there. And so, in the Olympic National Forest, they get 200 inches of rain a year, or maybe 300 in some cases. And on the rain shadow side of the Cascades, we get 3. And so that's, but the interesting thing is it's not, because it's far enough north, it's not very hot. I mean, it's warm, but it's not. In fact, I think Richmond, which is the closest little town to the vineyards, has the same number of days over 90 degrees as St. Helena. It's just dry up there.
Sure.
And so until I got involved up there, I didn't really realize what that meant. It means that the grapevines are totally dependent on you as a viticulturist. If the vines grow too much or they don't grow enough, it's your fault because you didn't water them properly. So that makes for a huge advantage to almost any place else in the world. The ability to manage the water. So, for example, in Bordeaux, they're always talking about they don't have to irrigate, and that they use that as a pejorative in Napa Valley. Oh, you guys have to irrigate. Well, okay, God irrigates for them. If you look at the rainfall in Bordeaux, they get about the same amount of rain as we do in Napa. They just get an even amount every month all year long. So they have about 30 inches of rain usually a year. And so during the middle of the summer, they get, a third of that. And that's too much water for grapevines. And so what I tell people is that, God irrigates for them, and God isn't necessarily interested in making fine wine. And so here in Napa, the issue is spring rains. So if we have a dry winter or the rains are early, like November, December, and the soils dry out a bit, then you don't have so much trouble in the spring. But if it rains in May, those are the years where the harvests aren't as interesting. And that's because those vines are growing and you can't get the water away from them. And if they grow too much, then the berry size gets bigger. And it's the berry size that really does, I think, in many ways, drives wine quality. So in Washington, in the Red Mountain area, the terroir, or the soils, were really laid down by during the Ice Age. You probably know about the Missoula floods or have heard about them. All of Montana was a big lake, and as the glaciers covered the Columbia and the Snake Rivers, this big lake backed up behind the ice dams, and when those ice dams would break, that whole huge lake would drain in a month. And that's why the Columbia Gorge looks like what it does, is because it just blasted, water down through the river gorge and carved it out. And it's recent enough that hasn't eroded away, so that's why the cliffs are so steep. In the Red Mountain area, each one of those big floods would lay down, 30 feet of silt. And so the soils are sandy, but they're pretty rich with minerals, and they're well drained. So in the winter, if you get 4 inches of rain, by bud break, it's pretty well drained out. So I just remember the vineyard company that's working for us up there, looking at, okay, we need to start irrigating before bud break. It's like, you're kidding. I'm from Napa, where you would never consider doing that. But up there, you have to get enough water in the soil to get the shoot length you want early. And so you're in total control, which is amazing. Most all the vineyards in Washington that were planted early all had leaf roll virus. And by the time the vines get to be 20 years old, that leaf roll virus has taken its toll. And a lot of times it just doesn't get quite ripe enough. I mean, it might get sugar ripe, but it doesn't get mature flavors. And so there's lots of talk about, that leaf roll virus improves the quality. But if you talk to most winemakers and say, you choose, you want vines that have leaf roll virus or not? I can't think of a single one that'll say, oh yeah, no, I want leaf roll virus vines. Well, the property's 250 acres, I think, but because of the water rights, we only are allowed to plant 140 acres.
That's still pretty big.
It's big. No, it's a big vineyard. So originally, the Gellises only had 120 acres, so we've put it in another 20 to maximize our water rights. And when they bought the property, like I said, that all needed to be replanted, so I put together a 15-year plan for them to replant the vineyard. And the first third of that's already been done, and the second third is just getting started. We just pulled out a third of the vineyard right after harvest this year, and we're replanting that. And what's new about what we're doing is, and we're kind of blazing the trail here in Washington, is we're using rootstock. Almost all of eastern Washington's planted on its own roots, and has been for a long time. And the reason is because, warm sandy soils are not real conducive to phylloxera, and so they could get away with it, or at least they thought they could. And that certainly was true in Monterey originally as well. You probably know that story, that Davis recommended that people could grow vines on their own roots down there because it was warm sandy soils. Well, after about 10, 15 years, they got caught up with phylloxera. Well, Washington, that's been a little longer, but it's now finally happened that phylloxera is pretty well established in the Walla Walla area, and we're seeing it now in the Red Mountain area as well. So I just told the Terlatos that was a risk that I wouldn't like them to take.
Sure.
And so, and in fact, part of the argument I used with them, because John Terlato was interested in planting stuff on its own roots again. I said, well, John, part of the reason you don't want to do that is because rootstock allows you to tailor the site to the vines you want to plant. If you plant Cabernet, say, on its own roots, then in some soils that's going to be too vigorous, and other soils it's going to not be vigorous enough, and some soils it's just right. But with rootstocks, if you pay attention to how vigorous the rootstock is, you can have just right everywhere. Part of the problem up there was, and what I really struggled with and worked on a lot, was not so much phylloxera, because all of the rootstocks that people use are all resistant to phylloxera. But the main issue up in Washington is root knot nematodes, which is a problem in sandy soils the world over. And in California, there's not been much work on high-quality vineyards with root knot. And the reason for that is that the coastal vineyards, where all the high-quality fruit comes from, root knot's not a problem. It's really in the Central Valley where you see root knot. And those people, in general, are looking at volume, not quality, and so the rootstocks that they pick are not necessarily quality rootstocks, they're ones for volume. And so it's like, well, okay, what do I do? And I asked a lot of people all over, and nobody really had a good answer for that. So I struggled quite a bit on it and picked rootstocks that I thought were going to be resistant to root knot, and I knew were high quality rootstocks. So, we'll see. Klipsun, Klipsun, so it's the clipped sun that we talked about, .com. Thank you. I've been watching your stuff for a long time, and it's like, well, how come he hasn't asked me? So I ask you.